My name is Jagveer. Once again, I'm going to tell you a lot more about myself towards the end of the presentation, which is what I always do. But let's get started. Okay, so the agenda on the session, we're going to talk a lot about social support. I'm going to touch a little bit on isolation. What is the role of social support in the recovery and healing of victims and survivors of intimate partner violence? I probably will refer it as IPV for the rest of the presentation. What is our role as professionals in their recovery and healing? And then I'm going to conclude. And before I go any further, I also want to mention that sometimes it just comes out of my mouth that I will say the words me, you, but all that refers to victims and survivors. Okay. We talked about a lot of negative things that victims and survivors go through. One of the things that they go through is isolation. Isolation is a very slow, gradual process. Sometimes victims and survivors are not even aware that they're going through it. But what that brings in these victims or survivors, first one is they doubt themselves. The self-confidence, self-esteem drains over time, and that makes the survivors and victims doubt everything that they do, doubt any little step that they take forward for their healing and recovery, and then they go 2 steps back. They start to question their own judgment because let's not forget that for years they were living with a partner, or interacting with a partner or a husband, whatever you call it. Oh, by the way, before I go there, IPV actually affects all gender, but most of my work is on women, so from time to time I will use that word as well. So the survivors and the victims, they start questioning their own judgment because, hey, if they weren't able to change the abuser, then they probably feel worthless. So unworthiness is another thing. I wasn't able to do the things that I really wanted to do in life. I'm not good enough. I'm unworthy. And that makes these survivors and victims do maladaptive coping. Substance abuse is one of the biggest one. And when these victims and survivors, they start alcohol misuse, any kind of other substance abuse, what they're really doing to themselves is bringing in more loneliness. And so they suffer with isolation more and more. But what is it really doing to them? Increasing the dependency on the abuser, something that the abuser wants. And what this also means is it gives more power to the abuser and less power to the victims and the survivor. And so we ask, why don't they ask for help? What goes on in their mind when they're isolated? What we see is, and there's a big variation with these numbers with IPV survivorship, usually you will see 30 to 80%, 50 to 95%. So 50 to 95% of victims and survivors, they hesitate to get any kind of help. And even when they do, and out of these 50% of the ones, they seek healthcare. So an example here would be if it's normal, like small bruises, cuts, nicks, because of the abuse, they're gonna just not tell anybody. They will go to healthcare setting if they have a broken bone, as an example, because they can't really deal with it on their own. And when I talked about a couple of years ago at IVET here, and I mentioned that the first time I was abused, I only went to my doctor because I couldn't see from my left eye for like 20 minutes. So I figured, something might be wrong, I need to go see a doctor. Even if they end up going to the medical providers, almost 60% of them actually don't disclose. And giving you my example again, I went to the doctor and I said I couldn't see for a period of time, and I didn't really tell what really happened. I said I fell off hiking. And yes, I did see a disbelief in the doctor's eye, but 60% of us or survivors, they actually don't tell. And almost a little bit less than that, they actually don't report to the police. So What does social support mean for survivors? This is what's going to be the rest of the session. And I'm just going to give a definition which is pretty self-explanatory, but it is any provision or of assistance which may be financial or emotional that is recognized by both the beneficiary and the provider as advantageous to the beneficiary's welfare. Types of social support. The first one is informal support. That is where the friends come into picture, the colleagues, the community members, they are all informal support. They are able to better match the needs of the survivor. So as an example, if the survivor is turning to a friend and the survivor says, I just want you to hear me out, I don't want to do anything. And most of the victims and survivors actually do say this over and over again. They are ready when they are. And friends understand that, and they are able to trust the friends. This is really, really crucial for immediate and long-term sustainability, long-term need of the victims and survivors. But where it's unhelpful is it just may not be always helpful. You don't know what the friends are going to say. They may not be familiar with what they're going through. They may give them some advice that will actually work in a negative way. And it may not be reliable. And with victims and survivors, many times when we talk to the victims and survivors, they say that the friends turn their back against them, and it's fairly common. Formal support is professionals like us, social service providers, violence against women services, and health professionals, including medical professionals. It works well because it's consistent, it's reliable, it's oftentimes evidence-based. Also, the programs that are being run, they also go through this iteration of improvements. So it is fairly consistent and reliable. Where it doesn't work is that the survivors may have difficulty in accessing services. We already saw an example during COVID, they had difficulty in accessing services. Immigration status, there's a huge population of victims and survivors who are either illegal immigrants, or even when they're legal immigrants, they're dependent on the abuser. So that's a big deterrent in asking for help. And racial discrimination, let's not forget, lower socioeconomic status. Some of the communities are more prone to domestic violence, and they're actually the ones who don't want to reach out because they already know that they're going to get discriminated against, so why bother? Dimensions of social support. There are multiple dimensions of social support. We're just going to cover some of them. The first one is tangible or instrumental support, providing a helping hand, and that helping hand comes with money, providing a temporary housing, like taking somebody in, cooking for the victims or survivor, providing child services, and providing other aids and services. The second one is informational support. This is where the victims get to know the what and where to go and how to proceed further from here. And that includes advice, suggestion, providing resources to them. The third one is emotional support. So this is really giving a shoulder to lean on. This person, so victims and survivors, they consider this person as trustworthy. They get a lot of love, a lot of empathy, there's a lot of acceptance, and they also feel heard. The next one is appraisal support. So this is basically, we cannot see our own backs. We need somebody to tell us, hey, what are we doing wrong? Where can we go from here? I need help. I just don't know how to go from here. What am I doing wrong? Right? So feedback from trusted individual. And what I haven't mentioned here is something called invisible, which is very common these days, and that's where a lot of social media comes into picture, all the YouTube videos, Instagram videos. So that is the invisible support, where you learn something from somewhere and then you pick up a keyword and then you start exploring all these dimensions and say where they fit in and how you can get help. Okay, let's talk about 3 levels of intervention. The first one is primary. So the aim here is to prevent the onset of violence. And an example here would be There's a commotion going on in the house next door. Your neighbor, there's yelling, screaming. You, as a concerned friend or a neighbor, go to the house and you're like, hey, what's going on? So you're really preventing that onset of violence. That hasn't happened yet. It's getting escalated, and you're gonna prevent that. The second one is secondary. So the aim here is to prevent further harm associated with violence that has already occurred. And an example here would be the violence has occurred, and again, just to give you an example, you walk over to the house next door and you see a victim crying. You either call the police, as an example, or you are able to confront the victim. And the last one is tertiary. So here the aim is to intervene and interrupt existing violence. And this has to do with what social workers, what therapists provide, what the legal entities provide. So this is where, either pointing them in to take some legal action, or helping them find shelter so that you are able to intervene in the future. And given the nature of the proximity of friends and colleagues and neighbors being close to you, 75% of victims and survivors, they actually reach out to the informal support. And these informal support are really beneficial in providing the primary intervention. They also provide secondary, but the first initial thing is that they can provide primary intervention. Formal support, on the other hand, very effective in providing tertiary support, but they also provide secondary. So secondary is shared between formal and informal. Benefits of social support, it should not come as a surprise, especially after the first presentation. It really mediates, it buffers and improves the outcome of IPV. It is the primary protective factor for victims who have experienced partner abuse. It is also known that higher level of this much needed support at the time of abuse, in all the ways that we learned earlier, emotional, informational, and tangible, it increases the further help-seeking behavior and also decreases the negative outcomes. And I was actually going to start the presentation with a story which I completely forgot, but I'm going to say it now. So I must have been 18, 19. There was a woman, South Asian woman, living next to my apartment in a fourplex, and she had 8 or 9 years at the time, and she also had a little baby, like 6-month-old. The husband came from India many years later, and they were united after many years. And so at the face of it, I actually thought that everything was going great, right? They're united, now they have a bigger family. And one night, it was around 2 or 3 a.m., there was a knock on my bedroom window from behind, and it was a frantic knock, and I heard, hey, Jagbir, open the door. And I knew that it was my neighbor. I went, I opened the door, and I saw this lady bleeding from the head, and she was in a panic mode, understandably so. And I asked her, and I didn't know what to do, first of all, but for me, I always thought that things are going well. And she was like, oh, my husband is intoxicated and he's beating me up. And I just didn't know what to do at that time. But the point I'm trying to make is that sometimes victims and survivors, they ask for help when it's like they're at the brink of like getting more harm, right? And that's what happened to her. And I asked her, what do you want me to do? Should I call emergency services? Should I call the cops? And she refused. So we need to tell this population that it's really, really critical for them to ask for help early on. And yes, this population also needs to understand that not everyone is going to help them. And availability of social support also helps the abused disclose their experiences of IPV and cope with issues. So in my case, my friends were super supportive, and they were the ones who were like pointing me in the right direction, telling me that, hey, I need to take more help, I need to get professional help. And social support is a strong indicator of economic well-being in rural and low-income areas. And so based on evidence, it's seen that people who have a really strong support system, they tend to do well economically, even in rural areas. Single parents, they also tend to do well if they have a good support system. So all in all, survivors with high level of social support are empowered to leave an abusive relationship. They are able to seek alternative dispute resolutions, and they are less likely to be restricted by social or traditional norms that really encourage individuals to stay in violent relationships. Okay, so social support is helpful, but why do people not ask for help? What is the difficulty there? First one I already mentioned, there are a lot of self-doubts and doubts about relying on others. You were relying on a person that you were living with, and that person did this to you, being violent, caused harm. So these victims often question, what makes me think that somebody else is going to help me out? Also, avoiding conflict became a coping strategy. So when these survivors and victims, they are living with the abuser, anytime they wanted to communicate that, hey, this is what's going on in the relationship, and anytime they wanted to resolve the conflict, that oftentimes results in more conflict. So now they're saying that, hey, you know what, I'm just afraid, I don't want to ask people for help. There's also unpredictability about how people will respond. And most of it has to do with how domestic violence also affects your cognition, your ability to think. You're not able to make good decisions for yourself, and this is one of them. If you don't ask, you are not going to know whether somebody is going to be helpful or not. And then also the assumption that, hey, you know, if my family loves me, then don't they already know that what I'm going through? Well, oftentimes, even if they know what you're going through, they don't want to ask you because they are afraid of how you will react. But the survivors and victims often think that people should know what they are going through. We're going to look at some of the barriers to seeking support then, even if they are ready to ask for help. What are the barriers? The first one is abuser may still have a strong hold on the finances, on anything else that you're dealing with. And also, at this time, there may be this perception that you need the abuser. And I talked about this in Hawaii earlier this year, but one of the women I talked to, she actually did move out of the house the first time around, and 2-3 weeks later, she went back. And the reason why she went back was because she's like, I need him. She was on a dependent visa. I don't have a visa. I don't have money. I don't know how to do the runaround. I don't even drive. I don't work. So this is what they were going through. And she basically used the word that I needed the abuser. Social isolation. This is what the whole talk is all about. When you're isolated, you're disconnected from people. And when you're disconnected from people, you just don't even want to interact with anybody. Lack of resources. This is where we're talking about geographic locations. Many of the rural areas, sometimes the services are very, very far away from the location. Also the socioeconomic status. If somebody doesn't have transportation, how are they going to ask for help? If somebody doesn't have phone available, because that happens even today. There's a lot of victim shaming. This is often seen in medical offices. This is also seen in legal offices, where usually people on the front desk who are not really well trained, they kind of lack empathy, and they do a lot of victim shaming, saying you must have done something, and that's why you're going through what you're going through. Socio-cultural barriers. Language is a big one. If you don't speak English well, if English is not your native language, how are you going to ask for help? Translation services generally are available, but we all know they're very time consuming. Even if we were to do a collateral call, it takes like almost 1 hour. Immigration status, we talked about that, and gender norms. This is where we are still in some way living in a patriarchal society, so there are those barriers as well. And negative perception and stigma. We already know that this topic is very sensitive. In fact, in the last couple of years, as I've been talking more and more, I see that people generally don't want to talk about it. If I post anything, and I'm very open, as an example, on social media, on LinkedIn, I see like very few likes because people generally want to avoid this topic. So those were applicable to both men and women, but for men specifically, why don't they seek help? First one, they often do not know that they are the victims. It may be the stigma, maybe the society we are living in, but they oftentimes are not aware that this is a toxic relationship. Shame, again, has to do with the society we're living in. Oftentimes they're like, hey, you know what, like, what will people think about me if I go and ask for help? And is anybody gonna believe me? So there is also a distrust of the support system. And you will hear men say that, oh yeah, all these pamphlets, all this paperwork is really women-centered. And that is true. At some level, we did start off with women because women were the ones who were coming out more. And that's why, rightfully so, men kind of distrust the system. Okay, so now let's say victims and survivors are ready to ask for help. They have asked for help. Then what? Are they going to receive help? In terms of barriers to receiving help, we are looking at, first and foremost, discrimination, experiencing judgment or bias from support providers. This is seen a lot in the legal system, in the courts. It's very evident if you were to attend one of the civil cases. Safety measures, inadequate protection measures after seeking help. And this, I'm giving an example of an ineffective restraining order. Anybody from Texas? Okay, so in last November, there was, it was in the news, a woman, she got the restraining order. She went to the police and she told them that she feels unsafe. Even after getting the restraining order, she feels unsafe. She felt that, she said that she feels that her estranged husband is gonna kill her, harm her. And the cops told her, hey, there's no evidence. We cannot really do anything. We have the restraining order. And she was like, well, yeah, the restraining order is there, but how do I know that it's being enforced? So she was sent home. Nothing was done. 2 weeks later, she was killed in her driveway a few feet away from her children. The children both were less than 10. So when you hear this news, things like that, then they don't really trust the system. Who's going to enforce these restraining orders? The next thing is inadequate support, mental health support, services related to trauma. A lot of professionals, they're not really trauma trained, trauma informed. And sometimes it happens that they fail to understand the unique challenges of people with diverse backgrounds. Also, they may not put the safety of the victims and the survivors first. They may say something that may trigger something in the victims and the survivors. And not just that, they may send the victim home, and something that they may have said can provoke, they can go home and there may be a conflict, and that's going to make situation even worse. Cultural insensitivity. I know in the last few years we talk a lot about multicultural aspects. However, we still know that the survivors from marginalized communities, they don't really receive the advice based on their culture. Things are way different in South Asian culture. Things are different in the rest of Asian culture. Things are different in Hispanic and also African American communities. Service limitations, we talked about it. Rural areas, sometimes the services are way, way far. And I live in San Francisco Bay, and it's densely populated. But I currently work at a psychiatric hospital, and they tend to turn away a lot of people because there's just only so many people that you can take in. And that's really discouraging to the victims and survivors. And let's talk about some facts on service limitation. Around 10% of survivors, they couldn't be helped because of limited resources. Higher poverty, minority, rural communities, they all tend to turn people away because they just can only have so many people. Another thing is that in some of these rural communities is what most of the time is seen is victims, they tend to go back and forth, right? And usually the person on the other hand, they don't understand. And they actually get to hear that, hey, you're gonna come back again after 1 month, so why bother, just go home, right? So those, people are very insensitive, non-empathetic in some of the areas. Okay, so what can we do? Obviously, the more we talk about this, the better it is, but we need to start with the informal support network. We need to enhance the education and awareness for this population, which means that we need to educate the friends and the family, and we need to tell them that they need to be more understanding, they need to be more empathetic. They are the first ones who hear about these things, and if they are judgmental, it doesn't serve neither the victim or survivors nor them, because this affects the families, this plague affects the communities. Seeking professional help. So giving my example, I was really reluctant to get professional help, but my friend really encouraged me to seek professional counseling, go through the support groups. So we need to educate these victims and survivors that it's okay to get help. Promote regular check-ins. Again, there's only so much we can do. We are often limited by what's being prescribed at work. How many times can you interact with victim of the survivor after they come to your office? And what I've seen is that, especially in the psychiatric hospital that I am at, and that's just an example, but we don't ever go back and check on the patients. I had a patient, she came to me, she kind of watched me for a few days, and then one fine day she comes to me and she's like, I need to talk to you. And I'm like, okay. So I started talking to her, and she told me about how she's being abused by her husband. And she said, I don't want to tell the authorities, I don't want to do anything, but what can you do for me? And I was able to provide her with a women's sanctuary, a phone number. She lived in a rural area. But taking my example, I never really followed up because there's no protocol in the psychiatric hospital to follow up on these patients or these victims. Let's talk about what we can do collectively as professionals. The first one is providing trauma-informed care. We need to recognize the signs of trauma. We need to respond appropriately. We need to create a safer, more supportive environment for the survivors. And this is where I say what to say to the victims. Use the words that you know are not triggering for them. Always put the safety of the victims and the survivors first. Another thing that we lack, where we could do better, is integrate all the services together. So here we're talking about integrating the service models to increase access to more comprehensive care, so involving the healthcare, involving the doctors, involving the ER, the urgent cares, where oftentimes victims end up when they ask for help. Using referral system, being more collaborative essentially. Cultural competency, we did talk about that. So we need to be respectful of other cultures. If we don't know enough about the other culture, we will ask for help. Consistent follow-ups, we need to figure out a way to kind of consistently follow up. I know that we all have limitations, but even if we can take one small step to follow up on maybe, one patient, two patients, we are still making a difference. Use of technology. I know in the earlier session we talked about how lack of Wi-Fi and internet kind of was discouraging, but what we also need to acknowledge is that post-COVID, a lot of healthcare providers offer online services, and that has opened up the doors for a lot of people. Face-to-face, obviously, we cannot really match that empathy, that connection, but something is better than nothing. Also, in the state of California at least, even now, you pick up your phone and call 15 therapists, social workers, none of those are available. So it's better to use technology and to reach out places farther away where they're accepting new clients. And also we need to promote support groups and peer networks. In the psychiatric hospital, I run a lot of groups, and there's a lot of peer support that people get. Obviously, that is not necessarily domestic violence groups, but in general, groups are very, very supportive intervention for a lot of these things. All right, and I'm going to conclude here. We collectively, we need to talk more about this problem. We need to promote stronger supportive social networks for victims and survivors. And I'm going to give another example, which I do share a lot of examples from my own survivorship period. If I did not have my friend who happened to be my neighbor, I probably wouldn't be here today. So we need to tell the victims and survivors, ask them that question: what kind of support system do you have? If you don't have anybody, which is something sometimes we hear a lot, then point them to support groups, peer support groups. They are oftentimes free, they are online, and it gives them a sense of connectivity, feeling that somebody is there, somebody is listening to them. All right, about me. So I just want to say that domestic violence does not discriminate. I graduated almost 20 years ago with a master's in engineering. So professionally, I'm working as an engineer. But post my survivorship, I got 2 masters, one in master's in liberal arts psychology from the Harvard Extension Studies. That was in 2022, and I just graduated in June with master's in counseling psychology. So I give my example for post-traumatic growth. I talk a lot about post-traumatic growth. I'm currently working as an associate marriage and family therapist in a psychiatric hospital in San Jose. And on the 20th of August, I became a debut author. The talk that I did 2 years ago as a survivor, I was able to convert that into a book. The book is outside. I'm going to do a signing at 10 o'clock. It's there in the exhibition area. So I speak on post-traumatic growth for IPV survivors. I also survived cancer twice in the last 6 months, and that was after survivorship period. And so then I took on yoga and meditation, and I also teach on Wednesdays for free on an online app. And the book that's out there, it is called Blooming Through the Cracks. It is a #1 new release on Amazon at the moment. And if you want to reach out to me, if you have any questions, I'm always responsive and I reply back. But you can reach out to me on my website, which is javeerkang.com. And check out the book if you like on Amazon. That's pretty much it.